How does a Vietnamese woman go from running real estate deals to stealing $12.5 billion? A crime so massive it led to a death sentence. The first ever given for a financial scandal in Vietnam.
A Vietnamese real estate tycoon has been sentenced to death in one of the country's largest financial fraud cases ever.
The scandal drained almost 3% of the country's economy, turning into the biggest fraud the nation had ever seen. But behind the headlines was something even more shocking. A secret that only came out after the final verdict, with consequences the Vietnamese people are still living with today. Her name was Trung My Lan. To most people in Ho Chi Minh City, she was just another businesswoman building hotels and luxury projects. But in Vietnam's booming economy of the 1990s and 2000s, where fortunes were made overnight and banks raced to hand out loans, Lan quickly built something far larger than anyone realized. She wasn't a celebrity, she wasn't in politics, yet she moved with influence few dared to question. Behind closed doors, her reach extended into the financial system itself, and as her empire kept growing, she was also constructing a machine of money and power that no one else could see. This is the story of wealth and ambition of a financial mastermind who rose in a nation of 100 million people. For her, rules were never boundaries, only tools, until they finally snapped. Vietnam was undergoing one of the most drastic transitions in its modern history. The Doi Mai reforms, launched in 1896, were reshaping the country from a closed, state-controlled economy into a market-oriented one. For the first time in decades, private businesses were encouraged, foreign investors were welcomed, and banks were under pressure to lend aggressively to fuel growth. Regulations were still weak, oversight was limited, and fortunes often depended on who you knew rather than what you built. This was the world Trung My Lan stepped into. She was born in 1956 in Ho Chi Minh City, the daughter of a Chinese-Vietnamese family who ran small businesses. Her upbringing was modest compared to the tycoon she would one day rival, but it gave her an early sense of how trade and money flowed into the city. By the 1990s, she began putting those instincts to work. Starting with property deals and hotel projects, she carved out a place in the city's fast-changing landscape. And as Ho Chi Minh City expanded, so did her footprint. Through her company, Van Tin Pat Group, she rose quickly into the skyline. New towers and luxury developments carried her name. But Lan knew that buildings alone were not the real prize. The bigger question was, who controlled the flow of money behind them? The banks were lending fast, chasing opportunity without asking too many questions. And where others saw risk, Lan saw an opening. Step by step, deal by deal, she pulled herself closer to that lifeblood, and soon she would find the key that unlocked it all, a bank that would turn her ambition into something far more dangerous. The key was Saigon Commercial Bank. In 2011, the company stepped in and forced 3 struggling banks to merge together with it. The goal was to stop them from failing and dragging the financial system down. On paper, it was a logical solution. In practice, it created a giant new bank that was vulnerable, loosely monitored, and open to anyone with enough money and influence to slip inside. That opening was all Trung My Lan needed. Vietnamese law limited how much of a bank a single person could own, usually no more than 5%. But Lan found ways around it. Relatives, employees, and associates were registered as shareholders, each appearing small enough to avoid suspicion. Taken together, their stakes gave her effective control. Ownership was only the first layer. Lan also placed trusted allies inside SCB itself, board members, executives, and managers who understood where their loyalty belonged. Every major decision, from approving loans to choosing who got credit, carried her shadow. On the surface, she remained just another developer. To the public, her group, Van Tin Pat, was a property company, not a financial empire. But behind the scenes, SCB was already being turned into her private engine of wealth. This is where the story shifts from clever to dangerous. SCB was not filled with Lan's money. It was filled with the savings of ordinary Vietnamese citizens, families depositing their earnings, businesses placing their capital, investors trusting the system. Billions sat inside the bank, waiting to be lent out responsibly. Instead, it became fuel for Lan's network. She and her associates built a web of shell companies, hundreds of them. Some had offices, others existed only on paper. These companies lined up for loans from SCB, and because Lan controlled both the lender and the borrowers, the approvals were automatic. The loans, often worth millions, flowed into companies that produced nothing. The money circled back into Lan's projects, buying land, funding developments, or vanishing into layered accounts that made the trail hard to follow. On SCB's balance sheets, it looked like normal banking activity. In reality, it was a closed loop. Deposits came in from the public, were handed out to fake companies, and reappeared in her empire. At first, the system was invisible. SCB appeared busy and profitable. Projects tied to her group were booming. Construction sites were active, and Lan's reputation grew. To outsiders, it looked like the story of a businesswoman riding Vietnam's economic wave. But the more she built, the more fragile it became. Because behind the skyscrapers and the balance sheets, her empire rested on money that wasn't really there. And sooner or later, someone would try to count it. That counting began in 2022. Regulators started looking more closely at Vietnam's banks, and SCB stood out. Its loan books were massive, far larger than a bank of its size should be carrying. The numbers didn't add up. When auditors looked closer, the borrower's cover fell apart. Many of the companies supposedly holding billions in loans had no offices, no staff, sometimes not even a phone line. They existed only on paper, shells tied back to her network. Later that year, depositors lined up outside SCB branches, desperate to pull out their savings. Allegations of fraud had spread, and confidence in the bank collapsed almost overnight. Crowds stretched down the sidewalks, some waiting hours, only to be told they could withdraw only limited amounts. To stop the panic from infecting the rest of the financial system, the government froze withdrawals and placed SCB under special control. Officials promised depositors their money was safe and pumped liquidity into the bank to keep it alive. But while the public was being reassured, investigators were working around the clock. The trail led back again and again to the same name, Tung My Lan. For decades, she had built in the shadows. Now, she was at the center of the largest financial scandal the country had ever seen. The numbers they uncovered were shocking. $12.5 billion taken through Lan's web of shell companies, equal to nearly 3% of Vietnam's GDP. For a country of 100 million people, it was more than just a crime. It was a blow to national trust. Ordinary families, businesses, and investors who had placed their money in SCB now saw their savings caught in the middle of the largest fraud in Vietnam's history. What looked like a financial powerhouse was revealed as a hollow shell, propped up by borrowed deposits and false loans. And at the center of it all was a woman who had managed to keep her name out of the spotlight for decades, until now. The silence ended in October 2022. Police moved into Ho Chi Minh City, and one of the richest women in Vietnam was led away in handcuffs. Her arrest marked the beginning of something never seen before. Over 85 people were pulled into the case, bank executives, company directors, even government officials accused of helping her move money or looking the other way. The trial lasted 5 weeks. Judges, lawyers, and rows of co-defendants filled the courtroom, each charge revealing how far her network had spread. The first details spilled out: forged documents, false collateral, billions in loans signed off without scrutiny. For years, Lan had kept her empire sealed behind layers of secrecy. Now, every layer was being peeled back in public, and what the court uncovered would stun the entire country. The defense tried to argue that Lan's empire was too complex for one person to control, but in the court's eyes, every loan, every forged file, and every shell company pointed back to her. She was the mastermind. The scale of the case was staggering. More than 600,000 pages of evidence filled over 100 boxes and took entire truckloads to deliver. Nearly 2,700 witnesses were summoned. When the verdict came, it broke new ground for Vietnam. Judges declared losses of more than $27 billion, the largest financial fraud in the nation's history. Lan was sentenced to death, an unseen punishment for financial crime. She was not the only one held accountable. 4 received life sentences, while dozens of others were given prison terms between 3 and 20 years. Even her family was implicated. Her husband received 9 years for helping move money through shell firms, while her niece was given 17 years for acting as a front inside the bank. Authorities seized cash, properties, and investments, eventually recovering about $17 billion to help compensate victims. But thousands of families who trusted SCB with their savings, they're still waiting to learn how much will ever be returned. In December 2024, Lan lost her appeal. The court ruled she could only avoid execution if she repaid nearly $11 billion, 3/4 of the stolen money. Then, in mid-2025, Vietnam changed its laws, removing the death penalty for embezzlement and financial crimes. With that shift, her sentence was reduced to life in prison. Her life had moved from hidden power to public punishment. But even that change could not erase the damage, the broken trust that spread through Vietnam's banks, its regulators, and its future. The case of Trung My Lan was more than the downfall of a tycoon. It exposed just how fragile Vietnam's financial system had become when oversight failed and influence went unchecked. Billions vanished, a bank collapsed, and the consequences reached millions of ordinary people. Her story is no longer just about one woman. It is about a country forced to confront the true cost of unchecked ambition.